If you clicked this, you're probably carrying guilt you don't deserve. Stay until the end, and you'll see the invisible mechanism behind it, and what stops it from working on you. You feel guilty, even when you didn't do anything wrong. Not because you hurt someone, not because you crossed a line. You just feel it, a sudden weight in your chest, a quiet pressure in your mind. And what makes this worse is that you assume it means something about you, that you're selfish, that you're insensitive, that you failed in some invisible way. But that guilt didn't come from your values. It didn't come from conscience. It was learned. You were trained to feel guilty as a way to keep yourself in check. And once you see how that training begins, you realize something unsettling. It was never your fault. You replay the conversation in your head, not because you're dramatic, not because you're sensitive, but because something about it felt wrong. You remember the moment your voice changed, the moment you paused, the moment you started choosing words more carefully. You weren't arguing, you weren't attacking, you were just trying to be understood. And yet somehow, you walked away feeling like you caused a problem. You start questioning yourself. Was my tone too harsh? Did I ask for too much? Should I have said it differently? Hours later, the conversation is over, but your body is still tense. You feel uneasy, restless, and slowly, without noticing, you begin rewriting the moment in your head, looking for where you went wrong. That's when guilt quietly takes shape, not as a clear thought, but as a feeling that lingers. And the more you sit with it, the more you start believing that this discomfort must mean something about you. That belief is not accidental. It's the first sign that conditioning has already begun. Most people assume guilt is a moral signal, that if it appears, it must be deserved. But real conscience doesn't confuse you. It doesn't linger. It doesn't keep replaying scenes in your head. Healthy guilt is calm and specific. It points to an action. Then it fades once you understand it. What you're experiencing is different. It's heavy, vague, urgent. It doesn't tell you what you did wrong. It just tells you that you are wrong. And that distinction matters, because this kind of guilt doesn't come from values. It comes from association. At some point, you learned that expressing yourself was followed by tension, by distance, by withdrawal. Your mind connected those dots. Speak honestly. Lose safety. So guilt became a warning signal, not about ethics but about survival. You weren't born with that response. You adapted to it. And once a reaction is framed as protection, the brain will repeat it automatically. That's why this guilt feels immediate, why it shows up before reflection, before logic. It's not judging your behavior. It's trying to prevent discomfort. And the moment you see that, the story about who you are starts to change. Conditioning doesn't happen through confrontation. It happens quietly, through patterns your nervous system learns to recognize. At first, nothing looks dangerous. You express a need. The response feels distant. You set a boundary. The warmth disappears. You say something honest, and the atmosphere shifts. No argument, no accusation, just a subtle tension that wasn't there before. Your body notices it immediately. The chest tightens. The mind starts scanning. What just changed? Your brain is wired to restore emotional safety as fast as possible. And when nothing obvious explains the discomfort, it looks inward. That's when guilt appears. Not as a conclusion, but as a shortcut. You apologize, you clarify, you soften what you meant, and the tension dissolves. The relief is immediate. Without realizing it, your nervous system records the sequence. Self-blame leads to safety. That lesson doesn't stay conscious. It sinks into the body. Over time, the pattern reverses. You don't wait for tension anymore. You anticipate it. You feel guilty before speaking. You hesitate before setting limits. Not because anyone told you to, but because your body remembers what happened last time. That's how control becomes internal. The pressure no longer comes from the outside. It lives in your reactions, in your silence, in your self-censorship. And once control reaches that level, it no longer needs effort. You regulate yourself, not to be honest, but to stay safe. The conditioning locks in at a very specific moment, not when they criticize you, not when they raise their voice, but when you start explaining yourself to manage how they feel. That's the shift most people miss. The moment you feel responsible for someone else's discomfort, the dynamic changes. You're no longer sharing information. You're negotiating emotional safety. You watch their reaction closely, the silence, the distance, and you adjust. You add context they didn't ask for. You soften what you meant. You backtrack slightly, just enough. Not because you're unsure of yourself, but because your body remembers what happens when tension stays unresolved. Over time, this becomes automatic. You sense the shift before it happens, and you move first. You apologize preemptively. You clarify before being questioned. That's the moment the control stops being external, because now you're the one maintaining it, not consciously, but instinctively. There's a simple way to tell if this conditioning is active in you, not by analyzing the other person, but by watching what happens inside you after the interaction ends. Pay attention to this. If you feel a sense of relief when the tension finally fades, not because the issue was resolved, but because the emotional pressure stopped, that's a sign. If you apologize just to restore calm, even when you're not sure what you did wrong, that's a sign. If silence makes your body restless and clarity feels risky, as if speaking honestly might cost you connection, that's a sign. Healthy guilt brings understanding. It leads to correction, then to peace. Conditioned guilt does the opposite. It leads to compliance. You don't gain clarity, you gain temporary relief. And over time, that relief becomes addictive. You start choosing emotional safety over honesty, not because you want to, but because your nervous system learned that safety comes first. Once you see this pattern clearly, it becomes harder to ignore, because the discomfort you feel isn't proof that you did something wrong. It's proof that the game is still active. Breaking this conditioning doesn't start with confrontation, and it doesn't start with explanation. Those are still reactions. The real shift begins when you stop offering guilt as a way to restore peace. You don't rush to fix the mood. You don't fill the silence with justifications or apologies. You don't over-explain your intentions to make yourself easier to accept. At first, this feels deeply uncomfortable. Your body expects consequences. It anticipates withdrawal, distance, punishment. But instead, something unexpected happens. Nothing, no explosion, no collapse, just space. And in that space, your nervous system begins to relearn. It discovers that discomfort is not danger, that silence is not abandonment, and that guilt is no longer necessary for protection. This isn't about becoming cold or emotionally distant, it's about becoming clear. When you stop managing other people's emotions, you regain access to your own. And without emotional fuel, the game slowly loses its power. Guilt was never your moral compass. It was a control mechanism. A quiet signal your mind learned to obey long before you questioned it. And the moment you stop responding to that signal, something shifts. Not because you fought back, but because you stopped participating. Most people don't realize they're still managing other people's emotions long after the conversation ends. That's where the real game is played. Not in words, but in reactions. And once you see how guilt was installed, you start noticing how often it's being triggered. Awareness doesn't end the game instantly, but it makes it impossible to play the same way again. Because the most powerful move in any mind game isn't control, it's clarity.